January 1st, 2025. Bourbon Street in New Orleans, one of the most famous party strips in the world. The clock has just struck midnight. The smell of beignets and alcohol fills the air, jazz spills from the clubs, and the streets are a sea of celebration. But in a matter of seconds, joy becomes carnage. A pickup truck suddenly barrels down the street, headlights blazing. People scream, bodies scatter, but there's no time. The truck plows through the crowd, crushing everything in its path. Moments later, the driver steps out, armed with a rifle. He fires into the chaos before engaging in a deadly shootout with police. By the time it's over, 15 people are dead, including the attacker. This is the story of the New Orleans truck attack of 2025. A night that began with fireworks ended in bloodshed, leaving behind questions that may never be answered. New Orleans is no stranger to crowds. Mardi Gras, Jazz Fest, football season, the city thrives on gatherings. On New Year's Eve, Bourbon Street was lined with locals and tourists, some in glittering outfits, others with feather boas and masks. Street performers played jazz riffs while bartenders poured hurricanes and daiquiris. Among the crowd were families, couples, and visitors from across the world. For many, it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience to ring in the new year on Bourbon Street. Nobody knew they were about to walk straight into one of the deadliest domestic attacks in recent U.S. history. At around 12:30 a.m., a dark-colored pickup truck turned sharply onto Bourbon Street. Witnesses later described hearing the rev of the engine before the vehicle accelerated into the packed pedestrian zone. People were flying through the air like rag dolls, one survivor recalled. It was like bowling pins being knocked over. The truck struck dozens, dragging some underneath, before coming to a violent stop against a light pole. Screams filled the air. The festive music stopped. Cell phones lit up as bystanders began to record in disbelief. But the nightmare wasn't over. The driver, later identified as a 36-year-old man with a troubled history, climbed out of the cab holding an AR-style rifle. He began firing indiscriminately. Panic turned into stampede. People trampled one another, trying to escape. Some ducked into bars and clubs, barricading the doors. Others threw themselves behind trash bins, mailboxes, anything that could serve as cover. Within minutes, New Orleans police officers on duty responded. A gunfight erupted in the heart of the French Quarter. Tourists, still in shock, caught the exchange on video. Bright flashes lighting up the night sky, echoing against the old buildings. By the time the gunfire ceased, 15 people lay dead, including the attacker. Dozens more were bleeding, many in critical condition. Sirens wailed. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Medics rushed onto the scene, turning Bourbon Street into what one witness called a war zone. Victims included both locals and tourists, ranging in age from a 17-year-old exchange student to a 62-year-old grandmother. In the chaos, strangers became heroes. Some used belts and shirts to stop bleeding. Others carried the wounded into bars, turning them into makeshift triage centers. Videos began flooding social media within minutes. Clips of the truck, the gunfire, and the aftermath spread like wildfire. By dawn, the hashtag New Orleans attack was trending worldwide. The FBI quickly joined the investigation. Who was the attacker? Why did he do this? The suspect was identified as a Louisiana man with a history of violent rants posted online. He had written manifestos filled with extremist language, anger at government, and disturbing fantasies of mass violence. Investigators pieced together that the attack may have been premeditated. For weeks, New Year's Eve chosen for maximum visibility, yet the full motive remained elusive. Some argued it was terrorism. Others pointed to untreated mental illness and personal grievances. The lines blurred, leaving the city with more questions than answers. Funerals began within days. The French Quarter, usually filled with music, was instead filled with candlelight vigils. Families clutched photos of their loved ones. Survivors spoke to the press. One woman, her arm in a sling, said, "I came here to celebrate life, and I saw death. I'll never forget the sound of that engine coming for us." Bars and clubs on Bourbon Street raised money for victims' families. Across the country, cities tightened security at holiday gatherings. New Orleans itself vowed to increase barriers and checkpoints to prevent vehicles from ever entering Bourbon Street crowds again. The attack reignited debates on domestic terrorism and gun control. Lawmakers clashed on whether the suspect should be labeled a terrorist. Some pointed to his extremist writings. Others argued he was simply a lone wolf with mental health struggles. Meanwhile, questions swirled about how he obtained his rifle so easily, despite his history of instability. Advocates demanded reforms. Opponents warned against politicizing tragedy. Even months later, the echoes of that night lingered. Survivors reported nightmares and PTSD. Some could no longer walk down Bourbon Street without flinching at the sound of an engine. Tourism briefly dipped as travelers questioned safety in New Orleans. But as the months passed, the city, known for resilience, began to heal. Musicians returned to the sidewalks. Tourists returned to the bars. Yet behind the laughter, there remains an unspoken scar. The New Orleans truck attack of 2025 remains one of the most shocking acts of violence in recent U.S. history. It began as a celebration of life and ended as a reminder of how fragile life truly is. In the blink of an eye, joy can turn into tragedy. And as the jazz returns to Bourbon Street, the question lingers. Was this the act of a terrorist, a madman, or both? For the victims and their families, the answer may never matter, because the scars of that night will last forever.